Welcome to Free Speech Television. My guest is Carl Safina. He is a MacArthur Fellow, Guggenheim Fellow, and I believe he still serves at Stony Brook as the Chair of Nature and Humanity?
That's correct, yes.
Great, terrific. And he is the author of a wonderful book, which I'm going to ask him to read a little bit from to start, called Beyond Words. Carl spoke at Bioneers today about animal intelligence, and we're going to explore some issues around that in this interview. Welcome, Carl.
Great,
thank you. Thank you for being here.
Yes, super to be with you.
I also want to say about Carl that he's one of the most inspirational nature writers. He's won a Lannan Award for writing, and I don't think I've read a writer since Peter Matheson who writes about animals as beautifully as you do. I wonder if you'd share.
Thank you.
I wonder if you'd read a little bit from the opening of the book about a herd of elephants.
Okay. And you could see their heads like warriors' shields, their great breaths gushing in and out, resonant in the halls of their lungs. The skin as they moved, wrinkled with time and wear, batiqued with the walk of ages, as if they lived within the creased maps of the lives they'd traveled. Travelers across landscapes and through timescapes, the skin moving like swishing corduroy, textured and rough, but sensitive to the slightest touch. The grind of their cobblestone molars as sheaf by sheaf and mouthful by mouthful they acquired the world, all the while uttering the contented purring of mounds of memories. Their rumbles rolled through the air like distant thunder approaching, vibrating through the undulating ground and the roots of trees, rallying families and friends from the hills and rivers, sending among themselves greetings and recognitions and news of where they had been, sending to us a sign of something coming.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you very much.
Mounds of memory. Do elephants have memory in the same way that humans do, or is their memory different from ours?
Well, the old expression is elephants never forget, and it's true that they don't. They have to remember not only dozens, but actually hundreds of other elephants that share the landscape and live within a population. They know different families. They have different relationships with different families. Some families are particularly close, and others kind of don't like each other. And they know all of that, and they remember all of that, just like we do.
That's extraordinary. It raises the question in my mind, there seems to be this prejudice in science, against thinking of the animal mind, of animal intelligence. And I wonder why that is. What is the source of that, do you think?
Well, first of all, there is a prejudice within science. It's not a prejudice that all scientists have, because many scientists are actually studying these things. They're studying animal minds, and people who research behavior in the field take it for granted that animals have minds and lives and thoughts and emotions, because they watch how complicated their lives are and how they negotiate everything that they have to do. But there is a bias, and the bias stems from one good reason and one bad reason. The good reason is that when the field of studying animal behavior was new, we really knew nothing about brain science. And so animals had centuries of mythology and just, these sort of cartoonish caricatures, like foxes are clever and ants are industrious and grasshoppers are lazy. And they needed to say, look, we have to just start from a blank slate. Like, we know nothing, let's see. And let's start building new information about them. And at the time, people had no way, there was really no brain science happening. So there was no way into their brains or into their minds. That's the good reason. It was a good reason at the time. But that was 60 or 70 years ago, and everything has changed. And the bad reason to keep saying it and feeling that way is actually a prejudice, which is we just keep insisting that we can't know anything about their minds, which kind of implies that they don't actually have minds and that they don't feel anything, that they aren't really aware of anything. And that plays to our favorite story about ourselves, which is that we are special in every way and categorically the best at everything.
Mm-hmm. So that our understanding of our own emotions, our own mind, which is actually very limited in some ways.
Well, we think we know a lot more about human consciousness than we do, because we say, oh, well, we know that humans do this, and humans can think this and feel this, and we leave it at that. But it's very strange to me how humans can differ so sharply and violently about their beliefs about things. For instance, we all live in the same world. How can we come to such incredible differences about certain things? And there are many people whose minds I'm totally perplexed about. I have no idea how their minds are working because it doesn't make any sense to me at all. Everything animals do is actually logical. They're great pragmatists and great empiricists. They don't believe things that aren't there. They look at reality and they respond to reality. And people are very different from that in a lot of ways that are very hard to understand. And we say, oh, well, we love our children. Well, I know how I love children, but that's not the same as somebody down the street who may or may not love their children, may treat their children poorly or maybe better than I do. I don't know. It's not as easy as these pat answers that we know everything about people and we know nothing about other animals.
So are there implications in the work that you've done, just observing, for instance, or trying to understand the question of emotions, animal emotions? We know about, for instance, elephants seem to exhibit a behavior that is mourning when one of their own dies.
Yeah, elephants do, and some other animals do.
You mentioned killer whales in the book or something.
Yeah, well, all these animals that have long-term bonds, when the one they're bonded to suddenly vanishes, they miss them.
We miss.
And they go around looking for them, and their rhythm of their life often changes. They may eat less. They may be depressed, as exhibited by a lack of activity for a while, and that's exactly what we do. We label all of that with a word called grief, but they do exactly the same thing, and then we say, oh, but it can't be grief because only humans can. But these things are probably very deep-seated. They come with bonding, and we know that many animals do bond if they live in these structured social groups. Those groups are stable over a long period of time because the animals are bonded. When one of them is suddenly not there anymore, they miss them a lot because their relationships are very meaningful to them.
How did Darwin understand emotion in animals? Did he at all?
He just took it for granted that animals have emotions because he understood not only intuitively but through all the logic that he applied to come up with the idea of how living things evolve, that we are all organically related and everything we have came from precursors. They came from other animals, other minds were already capable of most of what we have. We didn't just have a human brain created out of absolutely nothing. It came from another kind of brain, a pre-human brain, an ape-like brain, a mammalian brain, all the way back. These capacities aren't just suddenly all here with us from nothing. Almost all of them came from somewhere else, and we inherited them.
An example that has always struck me as amazing, it has to do with the behavior of birds that are able to fly long distances, like Arctic terns. I think there are a few others that do these 40,000-mile journeys yearly. And apparently some of them are able to continue flying while they're asleep.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about attention? And what can we learn from that behavior? I want to get to some of the lessons that you've studied in this question of intelligence.
Yeah, I'm not sure what we can learn from animals that seem to be able to continue activity with half their brains asleep. It seems different than what humans do.
Unless you believe that humans are asleep most of the time,
except that it often does kind of seem like we are half asleep most of the time. But apparently whales and dolphins also do that, and some birds do that. And I don't know. There's a lot of lessons to learn from a lot of things. I'm not sure what the lesson from that is.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about whales. About 3 months ago, a blue whale washed up, or a carcass of a blue whale washed up on Agate Beach in Bolinas. And this is the largest mammal on the planet. Beautiful, beautiful animal. And apparently it had been, there had been a collision with a freighter, and because it had had severe brain damage. And I just happened to be at the beach that day, and I was looking at this extraordinary, beautiful animal. And I started reading about them, and I got into the question of their language, of the tone that they emit underwater. Apparently, there are 13 different pods around the world of these blue whales. And one of the interesting things about them is that they have a distinct dialect. They have the same tones, but they enunciate it differently. Are there things about animal language that strike you in this question of their intelligence that you've observed like that?
Well, one is that many other animals get a lot of information across to one another. I don't really think they have the kind of language that humans have with grammar and syntax, our kind of language, which may be why it's been impossible to understand them, and yet they seem to get a lot more information across to one another than we seem to hear in what they're doing. But nonetheless, many of them do a lot more with communication than we tend to think they do. And they live in very complicated environments. They have to do very complicated things. And often they're very vocal about it. So there is a lot of information in the world, and a lot of song and singing in the world as well. And it has worked for them for a really long time. So I think that we should try listening a little bit better.
Are there implications for how we study, or how we should study animals? Are there things that you think biologists and animal behaviorists, that field needs to adapt to based on what you've learned?
Sure. Well, one implication is that many of them are individuals to one another, and they have relationships with one another. They're not just numbers, not just it's not just 6 killer whales. It's those particular ones are individuals with each other. They really have lives, and we've only just started to understand that about all animals, really, and some of them have structured social groups where their relationships one-to-one in these little networks of families or clans really matter to them and define who they are as individuals. Mostly we've never thought about that. Wolves, some whales, some dolphins, killer whales are a great example, and some birds. I mean, you can look all throughout and you find examples of it. Not all of them are like that, but I mean, herring are not really like that. They don't have individual relationships with one another that are stable, but some animals certainly do. Elephants, killer whales.
Can you give me a description of what that actually looks like, say, with wolves? I mean,
wolves live in a nuclear family like people do. There's a breeding male and female. That's mom and dad, and then the rest of what we call the pack is their nuclear family. It's their children from the last 2 or 3 years, and then when the children become adolescents, they leave to try to find their own stake in the world, just like in our own homes. The children grow up, they leave to try to find their own stake in the world. That's a nuclear family. We could say we live in packs. We call them packs because that was the name we gave to groups of wolves before we knew anything about them, but they are nuclear family.
What is your current work focused on?
Well, I'm trying to make a case for life on Earth by helping to understand and explain what the human relationship is with the rest of the living world, and why living things want to stay alive, and why they have every bit as moral a claim to existence in the world as do human beings.
So that's certainly an important implication of this research into animal intelligence.
Yeah.
Are you writing anything currently?
I'm always writing a few little small things, mostly about issues in conservation, and I'm writing a book that is about social learning in animals, what they need to learn from the groups they live in that they don't get entirely through their instincts. So the different cultural differences in different families or different populations in different places of certain animals like whales and chimpanzees and macaws. Those are animals I'm trying to focus on in this book.
Okay. And where are you doing that work? In
the Caribbean and in South America, the Peruvian Amazon, and in Uganda.
Very good. Thank you, Carl. I really
Thank you very much. Yeah, well,